For more than a decade, Russia has pumped poison into the bloodstream of our civilization in the form of hypnotic lies and myths. My guest today, Stephen Douglas, has been parsing these, researching these, looking for patterns in the propagandistic narratives. He calls this study disinfolklore. These human crafted mythical falsehoods are a form of simplistic yet impactful fairy tale nonsense. But unfortunately, they work. They have effects in the real world. They change how people think, they change how people vote. And the rise of social media and other technologies have come at a perfect time to amplify these narratives, amplify this way of thinking, and it's giving rise to extreme disquiet in some quarters, for instance, about the US election, but also the rise of the far right in Europe. Today, we're discussing how Russia uses these narrative patterns and uses modern technology to amplify them and inject these into our informational bloodstream. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please check you are subscribed. There's been some algorithmic oddness recently. A lot of channels have had a mass unsubscribe following the election. That may well be bots and trolls disengaging. It may be something a little more sinister, but do please make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the future guests. Thank you also to everyone who has become a patron or bought me a coffee. It is incredibly important to help support the work of the channel. And thank you also to people who have supported our documentary film project. This is kicking off. It is happening. We are planning the first trips to gather footage for the film. And of course, we will be sharing it on the channel. But we do need funds to complete that, to get it edited, to get it into film festivals in order to challenge the Russian propagandistic films that unfortunately are still doing the rounds through the world's film festivals and unfortunately having an impact on distorting the reality of Russian aggression and its war in Ukraine. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Douglas, who is a self-described expert in combat propaganda. He is a former diplomat and the creator of Decoding Trolls and Disinfolklore. The latter has been described in a Byline Times review as a brilliant new analytical method to parse and counter disinformation. And if you enjoy this, this is our second conversation on the channel, so please do check out the first one, which we did earlier this year. Stephen, welcome back.
Great to be back. Really looking forward to seeing the film when you get it made. Really enjoying the Fog of War channel in your information warfare initiative on YouTube. It's great to have Ukrainian voices and Ukrainian journalist voices interpreting reality for us.
Well, it's an incredibly lucky and coincidental meeting there. This is a postgraduate student at Oxford, but as you say, she's Ukrainian and she understands and is familiar with the entire landscape of Ukrainian media, including all the shifts and changes that have happened as, the power of oligarchs has been challenged by independent media, and then the full-scale war oligarchs have started to be pushed out of media. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating story. We'll be doing, one of these a week at least. And yeah, for anyone interested in the challenges of modern media, I think that's an invaluable series of videos. But so thank you for noticing that. They haven't got the same traction as the videos on the main channel yet, but we are hoping to build those up into a useful resource. Well, let's start with your work because, I think we were talking just before we hit record that you were worried that somehow, if Harris got in, your methodology might have less relevance. There are silver linings to the chaos we see unfolding, and that is that you and I and others in the information space, well, we really have our work cut out now because it seems to me the worst case scenario is unfolding as perhaps we didn't want to believe would happen, but perhaps suspected would.
Yes, I set out in really the autumn of 2019, and then I really went full time on it in February 2020 to try and understand what Donald was doing when he was trolling. And by trolling, I don't mean in a negative way, just moving people's emotions. And some of our emotions are moved in a particular direction by the words he uses. And I wanted to understand that technique. And after a year after the full-scale invasion, in February 2023, I invented the neologism disinfolklore to basically capture my past 7 years, my previous 7 years' work as a diplomat in Eastern Ukraine, trying to understand what Russia was doing, particularly in Russia-occupied Ukraine. They were othering Ukrainians and preparing the ground for something I didn't know what at the time. And after the full-scale invasion, I realized that this entire propaganda apparatus, this disinfolklore apparatus, was using folkloric tropes from traditional folklore, but also their modern analogies to create in the minds of Ukrainians in Russia-occupied Ukraine a sense of that they were not Ukrainian and that Ukrainians were trying to kill them. And this is not dissimilar to the MAGA, what I call MAGA disinfolklore, which is created as, and again, I'm talking about this in neutral ways, which has created a sense of community among a proportion of the US population. And many non-MAGA people who voted for Donald were intrigued enough or trolled enough, emotionally moved enough to vote for Donald. They are not MAGA, and yet they still voted for Donald. And so when President Biden won the 2020 election, I thought, well, I've had a good run of it. And then Jan 6th happened. And then again, Trump, Donald, I refer to him as Donald, won this election. And I realized, well, actually, all that I had designed into Disinfolklore, the book version, and counter Disinfolklore is now more relevant than ever.
It's interesting, isn't it? As you were saying this, it strikes me that Russia has made a significant transition. Um, and actually, the US has as well. Because if we look at the propagandistic tropes of the Cold War, they're far more ideological, far more systemic. So, people in Russia were told that our system is superior, our system produces greater bounty, and is more effective, and actually people in the West generally, live much worse than we do, and whether that was believable or not, certainly that was a core part. But it's sort of a systemic othering, as it were. And of course, there are many people in Russia who look around and think, well, this isn't great. So, it's far less effective in that sense because it's more demonstrably disprovable, or you can easily perhaps put it to one side and go, actually, it doesn't really concern me. What we're seeing now, of course, is something that is far more tapping into emotions. It's not as ideological, as it were, and even the stuff about trans and whatever that we'll come on to in a minute. Um, it is not actually systemic. It is taking people and saying, no, it's your values that are under threat. It's your identity that's under threat. And these people aren't simply going to change the system you live under. They're going to kill you and your children. And if they can't, they're going to at least, mangle your identities and destroy your identity, which amounts to the same thing as death. So we've gone from systemic folklore to essentially, is it true to say, really genocidal part of it in character? It taps into very deep and dark fears that humans have.
I've been thinking a lot about what if we compare. We have a sense that Donald and Putin and maybe Netanyahu and other global leaders there's something similar about them, and we use the term authoritarian minded to describe this. In Disinfolklore, one of the main elements, when I use this concept of mana energy, so you're looking for the energy in memes, whether those memes are linguistic, audible, or visual. So not just what we think about internet memes. These are memes we exchange all the time as a function of being human beings. And the manner of coercive control. So this idea of I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you, and it's actually on the statute book in England now, England and Wales. This a pattern of behaviour. It's usually a male to a female, in which they are trapped in this coercive control relationship. And I'm not the first person to notice that the relationship between Donald and his most fervent supporters is one of coercive control. It has the energy of coercive control. So about half of the many emails you'll receive each day from Donald's campaign will say literally, I love you, I love you, I love you. And then the rest of them will talk about how horrible America is and how terrible it is and how he needs you to do this for him. And the manner of coercive control is also in the Russian occupation of Ukraine, so on the micro level, between the individual FSB operatives in the torture chambers they found in deoccupied parts of Ukraine. So it's on a micro scale, but it's also on a macro scale where Putin is very much loved by his people, and as you were saying, Jonathan, he's building this positive community within Russia by othering the West, othering us, and we are the ones who are basically being used as an instrument to form this community. And in Donald's case, or in the MAGA case, the liberals or trans or migrants are being used to create this other. So one significant difference is that in the Russian case, they're generally using external others, whether they're Ukrainians or Westerners, to create the sense of community inside. Whereas in the Donald case, they're using internal America, constantly dissing America and constantly dissing the liberals. And a significant difference at the moment, at the time being, but I'm watching it very closely, is what we talked about before in the genocidal aspect of it, which was during my 7 years in eastern Ukraine and going daily into Russia-occupied Ukraine between 2015 and 2018. At Stanice which is the border, a river that borders Russia-occupied Ukraine and Ukrainian government-controlled Ukraine. This information space which Russia created inside Russia-occupied Ukraine, which contained all of these folkloric elements of that Ukrainian mercenaries 10,000 Polish mercenaries were collecting on one side of the river and were going to come in and eat your children, and just thousands of articles every day. This was also matched by something I didn't know at the time, but every single news broadcast in Russia, radio, TV, across the whole of Russia, every day from 2014 onwards, contained references to mythical attacks which never happened, shellings of buildings in Donetsk and in Luhansk by Ukrainian military. These never happened. I was often on the spot when these attacks were supposed to have happened. And both of these elements, I couldn't understand what was going on. Within a week of the full-scale invasion, and certainly by Bucha, I use the word genocide in my work, my online work, and I'm an international lawyer, so I'm very careful about using such terms. And I noticed President Duda of Poland first referred to what was going on as genocide around the 10th of March 2022. President Zelenskyy used the term first in public as he was visiting Bucha around the 10th of April. And what I suddenly realized was actually this disinfolklore apparatus constantly brainwashing people into believing in a reality that didn't exist. Both inside Russia-occupied Ukraine was about preparing Ukrainians inside Russia-occupied Ukraine into thinking they are no longer Ukrainian, they're Russian. And not only that, but that Ukrainians are coming in and NATO and Polish mercenaries are coming across this river, across this boundary to kill them and eat their children and do all sorts of things. And what was going on in Russia is what I think for 7, 8 years, they were being prepared to kill Ukrainians, both on an individual level, but also as a society to tolerate the evisceration of all of these cities, like Mariupol and Severodonetsk, where I lived from 2015 to 2018. And I believe that is, and many of us understand, that this is what's in store for all of us. We are all being othered. And so on the Russia side, we can see the genocidal link. We can see what's happening in eastern Ukraine and Russia-occupied Ukraine with the forcible transfer of the children. And many of us, some of us who can, John Locke, your great guest recently, I really appreciated him because he went to Ukraine and he spoke to Ukrainians and he came back. And the vibe I got from your conversation, Jonathan, was that he came back from Ukraine a changed person with a different perception. And I spoke to hundreds of elected leaders in Russia, in eastern Ukraine between 2015 and 2022. And the story they told me led me to conclude that Ukraine would resist. It will never surrender to Russian aggression. And this was even before the full-scale invasion. And so that anyone who thinks about peace, that Ukraine will somehow surrender, it just doesn't understand Ukrainians, Ukraine, and what they've gone through. But for me, it's also a question of what the Russians would be happily shelling Lisbon if they could get there. If they could get their MLRS into the outskirts of Lisbon, they'd be happy as Larry to shell it because they've had 8 years of disinfolklore promoted inside all of their news, all of their TV programs about how we're all attacking them, we're all against them, and if they don't kill us, we're going to kill them first. And my fear, I don't know what's coming. None of us know what's coming next in America. But my concern is the structural similarities between MAGA disinfolklore and the lies and the truthiness which is broadcast, which got Donald elected. Quite apart from how that might undermine a mandate, what can come next is quite worrying. So the mass deportations of 1 million people, maybe up to 20 million people, of the children of or the parents of children who were born who may have got naturalized citizenship as a result of the birth of their children, but they were in the US illegally when they had these children. This raises considerable concerns on a genocidal level, because as we know, one of the 6 elements of the crime of genocide in international law is the forcible deportation of populations and of children. And it's quite concerning, and I think we should be watching it. I mean, yeah.
Without legal due process and so on. And this is interesting to me because you mentioned these stories, and some people may not be familiar with it. They may think that, you've got butcher and you've got this behavior and it just comes out of the blue. But I think anyone, and I kick myself for not for following this in more detail from 2014 onwards. It was there in the back of my mind. I could hear the disturbing genocidal rhetoric. I dip into, Russian propagandistic media, and it was so at variance with what I'd experienced by watching the news there nightly, just 10 years sort of previously. It was like night and day. It was a dramatic change. And then you had these stories, such as the crucified boy is the sort of classic one, Распятый мальчик. And this is the idea that the next child was crucified by these vicious, vampiric, bloodthirsty Ukrainians. Of course, the entire story was made up. It never happened. There was no such thing. But this story was hammered home daily, as you say, on Russian news. It became almost like a sort of religious mantra that whatever rational argument you put forward, you have this sort of mantra that you can sing back to drown out truth, to drown out any need to consider reality or think critically. So, how important are these folkloric tropes in normalizing the abnormal, in actually preventing people from thinking deeply and rationally about what's really going on? And of course, preventing them from the realization that they are being manipulated.
I started off with an intuition because I was on this bridge in this, like it's a beautiful place. It's now under occupation, Stanitsa Luhansk, and I long to return there after the deoccupation. It's a bridge separating a forest, beautiful forest either side. It's the Donets River, a beautiful old river which has been known since antiquity. And either side of the river, you had a biosphere reserve, and I was my job monitoring in this 400 square kilometer box, monitoring the uneasy peace, the Minsk 1 and 2 between Russia occupiers and Ukrainians, was a lot of the action took place on a bridge. And of course, the most famous troll tale, probably the most famous folkloric tale in the Western literary tradition is about three trolls trying to cross a bridge, or sorry, three goats trying to cross a bridge, which is guarded by a troll. And so the folkloric resonances of that situation struck me immediately. But gradually, as I began to think about it and study the origins of folklore, and particularly the origin of the modern nation state, which it came out of an insight by a German thinker called Herder, who in the late 18th century compared Germany, which at that time was 10 inchoate tribes, the 10 traditional Germanic tribes who had been set out by Tacitus, the Roman writer, in 50 years after the Common Era began. He compared Germany's plight with England's and basically said, where is our Shakespeare? We have no Shakespeare. We cannot unify without a common culture. And he set inspired by these faked Usheen tales, which Macpherson had, I know, Jonathan, you have connections to Scotland. The Usheen tales, which really just erupted into the consciousness of Western civilization in the 17th century. And it turned out to be fake, but basically they privileged the perspective of the folk, the normal people. And Herder's insight was that we cannot have one German nation, one German state, unless we have a common culture. And 90 years later, Germany was unified for the first time in its history and became a unified state. And Wagner, the composer, used these tales which Tacitus had written down about the origins of the Germanic people, and this idea of Manus, it's in German, the name German, the first man who had three sons who represent the sovereignty, the security, the soldier. My name is Stephen, and Istaviones was one of the sons of Manus, and he represents the security, the army, the military function that the state needed. And you have the fertility, the third son, Ermin, who's analogous to Odin, who is memorialized in Woden's Day, and who is worshipped by the Wagner military guys who are part of Russia. And so you have this intertwining of folkloric themes. And what I realized was that actually the function of this disinfolklore apparatus, which in concrete terms was 100 or 200 or 300 different websites for every emotional, for every personality level that Russia opened. Like I liken it to, they arrived in Russia-occupied Luhansk and Russia-occupied Donetsk and in Crimea with an Ikea toolkit. And out of the toolkit, they unwrapped 100 or 1,000 different news websites, different TV stations, newspapers, and they flooded the zone with what I now call disinfolklore. And the content of this disinfolklore, the effect of it, was to create a sense of community among the population in the occupation. And the content of that community was, oh, Ukraine, we're not Ukrainian. Ukrainians are trying to kill us. The West is trying to kill us. Our protectors are Russia. So there's this trope which I use in disinfolklore where Russia and indeed in MAGA disinfolklore, you provoke the distress and then you purport to solve it. So you put us, you ruin everything. You let COVID run free, and then you're looking for thanks when you manage to save a few lives. And it's this. This is another aspect which characterizes this the Russian mode of governance and mode of occupation and mode of conquest that concerns me when I see it in MAGA disinfolklore as well. You create the chaos, and out of the chaos, the one salvation is the actual creator of the chaos, and so that's the connection is on multidimensional with folklore, with the nation forming. Storytelling and collection, which actually in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, I read in Timothy Snyder in one of his brilliant books about how the first manifestation of a Ukrainian consciousness in the Russian language, obviously Ukrainian had consciousness in the Ukrainian language, in the Russian language, in the empire, took place in the 1840s in the new university in Kharkiv. And it's a similar thing in Ireland, where we had the Celtic revival in the late 1890s. And we realized, oh, actually, we're a different people. And then basically almost every European people who became a nation state, recognized by international law today, had these stories, often based in folklore, which individuated them from other communities. And it's this, I believe, which Russia and MAGA disinfolklore, the people behind it, have a genius to create a sense of community using these folkloric tropes and these tales, but also the same structure. And if we're aware of it, then perhaps we can be a bit more careful about critiquing it and understanding what we're dealing with.
And this is where technology comes in, isn't it? Because in the Soviet Union, where you couldn't trust mainstream media, because essentially it was incredibly boring, but also, in amongst the sort of various facts, there was a huge proportion of absolute made up nonsense, and most people, well, many people realized that was so. But even if they didn't, it was just so unbelievably tedious, and so was the television. You kind of switch off. So the main way of people propagating stories about their reality was jokes, anecdotes, satire, humor, gossip, rumor. It existed on that kind of level. But without the means of mass transmission and communication, it's something that sort of goes back to a sort of almost a pre-literary tradition. Yes, you had written Samizdat as well, but actually the lifeblood of the culture was this sort of oral tradition of sharing stories, anecdotes, satire, and in some ways fables as well, because you can't necessarily, it's risky to directly describe your reality, so you have to create fairy tales. And of course, many writers who couldn't write serious fiction in Russia or satire turned to children's stories and fairy tales, where they could get that social satire and get it published in a way that the censors didn't spot it, as it were, and yet the readers would kind of spot the allegories in there. And it chimes with how they communicate in this very sort of anecdotal fashion. We're seeing something interesting, I think, happening here, that this time it's being combined with a very open and very scalable technology, and that is social media. But we're seeing the same pattern where mainstream media is denigrated and the preference is for, in this case, quite weaponized, but the preference is for far more anecdotal, emotive modes of communication, meme-based communication, because the propagation of it is very different on a completely different scale. It's absolutely ubiquitous. Is this perhaps one of the reasons why Russia seems to be so adept at these modern communications when really they were so clunky at them during the Soviet period?
Yeah, they have a love-hate relationship with fairy tales. I mean, famously, Gogol, the great Ukrainian writer who wrote mostly in Russian, and he went to Russia as someone who, like many of us, like yourself, Jonathan, and like many of us, really, until the full-scale invasion, admired the culture, loved Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and just thought this fantastic. And he went there and discovered actually it's all a bit rubbish. And he wrote Dead Souls, which has been on my mind the last few days because we've seen some data about the actual population of Russia may be significantly lower than the mental model, the archetype we have in our mind when we think, oh, inexhaustible human number of humans, and they have form, as the English would say, in that Dead Souls, where the local oligarchs were making extra money by dead people on the electoral roll. And basically, the Russian perspective on Gogol's work, which memorializes Ukrainian culture in a beautiful, wonderful way, was that these are just fairy tales. And so they use this to denigrate this kind of place of where little green men can conquer the Ukrainians. And it's these cute little leprechauns, basically fairies in Ukraine, but we're the real people in Muscovy, and yet the Russians they use these fairy tales themselves inside the disinfolklore apparatus. I was fascinated to learn, and I managed to get a copy of some of the pictures in it. If there's any oligarchs watching this who can afford or received one of the 400 copies of Prigozhin, the chef of Disinfolklore, is my moniker for him. Prigozhin, the chief of Wagner, the chief financier of Wagner, and Putin's chef, again, a folkloric idea of a chef, a cook. It immediately disarms you. You just think he's just a chef. He wrote a book of fairy tales, and this wonderful photograph on it. If you go to my disinfolklore.net, you'll see it in one of the recent episodes of him with his family and stuff, 2002. And so they have this love-hate relationship with folklore and fairy tales, and everywhere you look, it's there. The most recent, all that recent reporting about the doppelganger, which interestingly was named. This entire disinfolklore system was named by the European Union, EU versus disinfolklore as doppelganger. And then ironically, and doppelganger is, for those who don't know, it's a German, it's a Brothers Grimm collected this tale following Herder's call to try and form the German consciousness. And it just means the copying, like a doppelganger of something. And then the Russians copied that name and actually called in their own internal documents the doppelganger. But it originates in the thing. So, I mean, the metaphors and the devices write themselves. And recently I saw the most feared in Kommersant of all newspapers talk about disinfolklore. And this is why when we think of folklore, we think of Brothers Grimm and children's fairy tales. And one of my missions is to try and see, when you hear the news, whether it's the BBC or RTE or CNN or RT Today, what you are hearing there are these stories, and they inculcate rules inside them, and there's a certain energy inside them. And I have this mental algorithm, which I'm trying to popularize and which I use myself with 6, I call it the code of positive trolls, and there's 6 elements. But the first of the elements is generosity. And so if you're trying to interpret a particular meme, whether it's on the news or your friend is saying it to you, it's on the internet or anywhere, I see a continuity between all of these different modes of communication. It's not just the internet, it's not just X or Twitter. If the energy of this is ungenerous and ungenerosity, then you need to be cautious about letting it into your mind and acting on it. And it's really helpful because most MAGA disinfolklore is really ungenerous. The same thing with the Russian. It's really ungenerous. We have an intuitive sense of what's generous and what isn't. It's just not generous to talk about drowning migrants or getting rid of deporting families or splitting families up. And so if we are bamboozled, as the whole point of this disinfolklore apparatus is to bring messages from all elements. So in the end, we go, I don't know what to think. But if you don't know what to think, then the first element in the Code of Positive Trolls, generosity, is a good guide. It's kind of what we call it in business school discourse. It's good enough. Good enough, like it's like a good enough car, like certain forms of Chinese cars are good enough, or big Beko fridges from Turkey are good enough. I've got one myself. They'll last forever, and they work in all sorts of things. So you don't need one of these Smegs or one of these Italian fridges which always break down, which are really fancy and cost a lot of money. But it's good enough. Generosity is good enough. And then the second element is ethical discipline. So if the person is lying, even or deceiving you, deception, which is core to folk tales and core to the shaman tricksters, who the devil, or again Odin, who is a shaman trickster that we memorialized with our Wednesday, who is analogous to someone like Prigozhin, the chef of disinfolklore, or Donald, or Putin, or indeed President Zelenskyy, but he is usually very generous and he is always very ethical, whereas that cannot be said of all the other people in that way. So when you're reading these stories in whatever medium, or your friend is saying, oh, I just saw two migrants down the street and they've got this fancy car and their children are at private school and they only came here 5 minutes ago, rather than going, God, good on them, you're supposed to go, oh God, you should get them out, throw them out. And so we also proof our own reactions according to this generous, because we always feel good about ourselves when we are generous and when we experience generosity rather, out.
And Russian folklore has this curious tradition of the fool or the youngest son, the sort of it's called Ivan Durachok, Ivan the sort of slightly idiotic, but always seems to sort of have luck, seems to get one up over those who are in positions of power, those who ought to win in a particular scenario. Um, in that mythic folklore, Zelenskyy could be labeled as that position. He's the comedian, he's the joker, he's the guy why did you invade then? Because he's in power. You don't believe someone like that can put up resistance. So almost, Russia went against its own folkloric tradition by taking on, the equivalent of, Ivan the idiot. But of course, Zelenskyy is not an idiot. And typically people who can master humor tend to be, rather sharp in their thinking and rather deep in their understanding of how things work. But that's a kind of interesting comparison there, isn't it? And it may add an edge as to why, certainly Russian propagandists see Zelenskyy as an especial threat, because there's that template, there's that kind of archetype in their folkloric tradition.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me of that. I often felt like the idiot when I was in Eastern Ukraine and I had read Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and he was analogous to The Unreasonable Man. And he's basically the truth teller, the person who sees the truth and is stupid enough to voice it. And the entire Russian apparatus is about getting rid of the idiot, and ridiculing them because they get nowhere, and they'd be much better off conforming. Bertrand Russell, no, you know who I'm. Anyway, the 19th century Irish writer who wrote about the unreasonable man. And this idiot character in there, like we read it in the folklore, the disinfolklore, like Telegram is just full of disinfolklore. You can get lost in it. I don't have it because I don't think you can compromise with it without getting your mind addled. But I come across it through filters, like some of the great people that we read on X or Twitter, Natalka Ukraine, who spends their time dredging up this disinfolklore, and the idiot there is writing about how all 99 of his fellow unit have just been killed in a Ukrainian attack, and he's looking for a sandwich or something, or he's writing a letter to Putin, because he thinks that
Begging
Putin
letter to
will.
the Tsar, dear Father Tsar,
Exactly.
help us, please.
And that actually reminds me that basically Putin's thing is he blames his staff on everything. So the three-partite relationship is Putin, his staff, and then the people. And so the people, he always is respectful towards the people, unlike in MAGA disinfolklore. But he uses as his basically, oh, I'm just surrounded by idiots. And I noticed early, like when you see the transcripts of the soldiers in Bucha, it really gave me an insight into Dostoevsky's literature. And there's Ivan's Dream. And I wrote about it at the time. When I saw this transcript, it was like, it's basically this Russian soldier who's just killed, and he admits it on the phone call to his girlfriend and to his mother. He's just killed Ukrainians and taken their phones. And the reason we have these transcripts is they've murdered all these Ukrainian civilians, taken their phones, and then used these phones to call home. And Ukrainian intelligence was able to get all of the transcripts of their phone calls because they were using Ukrainians' phones. And in this conversation, one of them, this guy Ivan's Dream, is this really deep dream he's telling to his girlfriend. Oh, you came to me in a dream and I was half asleep, and you came in through the door and it was misty. And it mirrored exactly stuff you will see in Dostoevsky. It was the voice of Raskolnikov, who himself is a folkloric dunce. He is a dunce who doesn't come to any sense of enlightenment by the end of the book. He starts off as a dunce and he ends up as a dunce. But of course, we read it as this really deep literature. But he kills two women and then tries to get out of it. And so I liken Putin, who is another St. Petersburg law school educated dunce, who begins each morning like the folkloric dunce, with no memory of what they learned the day before, and they just get up and do the whole thing like a cartoon. They do the whole thing again. So it's a really deep mode of analysis that we can look into this. And from President Zelensky's point of view, I wrote a piece maybe about 2 weeks after the full-scale invasion began, and I'd been a great watcher of him since he emerged out of nowhere. I was political focal point for the OSCE in Dnipro, and I covered in Dnipropetrovsk, and I covered the second city of Dnipropetrovsk, Kryvyi Rih, where President Zelenskyy is from, and I visited many times this LGBTIQ group, which used the building where he grew up in as a base. And from that, I kind of got to know just the milieu from which he came. And then after the full-scale invasion, I realized, President Zelenskyy is what I characterize as the 21st century troll. By contrast, Putin is a 20th century troll. He understands and I'm not the first person to point this out, the KGB, you torture someone, they'll say this. Everything is coercion, and they can make anyone dance like pigeons on hot plates, which incidentally, this behaviorism, which is the philosophy that guides much of Silicon Valley's work that I learned from Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and now this milieu is in charge of America. So and this all comes from Skinner in Harvard, who thought if you can just look at the behavior of animals, of sentient beings, you can control them. But anyway, President Zelenskyy is this genius, the comic genius. He said recently he admired Charles Chaplin a lot more than Winston Churchill because of the great dictator. And we saw him recently when he met Donald in America. And Donald was going on about the perfect phone call and his first impeachment and how everything was fine. And he was very good friends with President Putin and President Zelenskyy, and he was going to bring peace in 24 hours. And I was sitting there not in control of my emotions, the Ukrainian perspective of how he wasn't talking about Ukraine. All he was talking about was his first impeachment, his perfect phone call. And President Zelenskyy responded on camera to President or then Donald, non-President Donald. Of course, you prefer me to President Putin. And this was like something from the kindergarten. But it was the perfect response. So I have a lot of hope at the moment, actually, that whatever opportunities there are for Ukraine to goad, persuade, troll, instigate, inspire America to accelerate its aid to Ukraine, President Zelenskyy and his team, who dealt with President Trump, then President Trump's team from first inauguration. As we know, Rick Perry, the energy secretary, came to Kyiv to the first inauguration, and before the first inauguration, presented President Zelenskyy's team with a list of names that they wanted to be added to the board of Naftogaz. And so this was the very beginning of President Zelenskyy was expecting this team to arrive here and, offer them a White House visit or whatever. But in fact, they asked them to replace the board members of Naftogaz, which wasn't in their gift because they had to get permission of the IMF and the EU, with people who had, and this is all in public domain now, with people who had a couple LPG gas container ships to sell to Ukraine, and who Donald had met at a fundraising dinner, and this is all Lev Parnas has written about this one now.
So when they talk about
that was their baptism of fire.
So when they point the finger at Hunter Biden, and of course there is some dodgy stuff there, I don't want to get into all of that. There's a certain amount of projection going on here because they're trying to pull the same stunt.
Absolutely. We've seen it all with and Giuliani and all of this stuff. And just on the point of President Zelenskyy and his team's experience, again, I think their core competency is optimizing whatever situations they find in really creative, brilliant ways. And President Zelenskyy himself is part of this. He's a very agile thinker, as we see with the Kursk operation. It's 21st century thinking. It's out of the box, and it's beautiful to watch and to observe. And so I'm optimistic that they will find a way to optimize the results from Donald. Now, the rest of the world may collapse and everything else, but I'm actually least worried about Ukraine in this
I see Ukraine as one of those Chinese nail houses, where they try to build a road around it, and this stubborn, no, we're going to stick to our thing. And that leads me to the sort of last question, because it's always seemed to me, since the full-scale war and since I started to understand, Maidan and the mechanics of that more, it seemed to me that Ukraine has something absolutely vital for us to learn and internalize. And that is, they've moved beyond, or perhaps they never had, if you listen to Timothy Schneider's lectures, they've never had this big man culture. And if we go back to many traditional societies, there is this concept of the big man, and it does distort all sorts of things in political and social life. Not least, it gives rise to this far more anecdotal method of modeling the world and communicating the world. So if we look at a sort of 20th century sort of Western liberal democracies, we're moving beyond charity being and charity and religion being the main mechanisms of human progress and divesting wealth to down through the population, etc., and even generating wealth. And in that systemic approach, you won't be able to help everybody, but you might be able to make 50%, 60%, 70% of your population richer by taking certain decisions and rational mechanical steps that can be modeled scientifically and then communicated in that fashion. If we go to the sort of big man anecdotal culture, you may only help 1 in 100 people. So systemically, objectively, it's far inferior in terms of its efficacy. But because your mode of communication is through this idea of the sort of infallible gods are, the highly fallible intermediaries, but you can turn that one case out of 100 into an anecdote, into a story. You can amplify it, lie about it, exaggerate it. You can create the impression that cumulatively you've done far more good than the more boring systemic approach. Now, certain societies, it seems to me, are far more susceptible to that. Russia is built on that. That's the fundamental system, the sort of gods are. They've never moved away from that, in fact. The US seems to be sliding towards that kind of anecdotal folkloric understanding of wealth creation and distribution. Ukraine seems to me they do not have this idea of the dear leader, the infallible leader. In fact, they have rather a healthy cynicism to it. We will support you as long as you are doing what we've asked you to do, supporting us, and what you were voted in to do. The minute you break from that, like Yanukovych, you're done, and everybody is going to rise up and push you out. And that is as true for Zelenskyy as it was for Yanukovych, I think. How does this fit in with your disinfolklore concept? Because on the one hand, you've got one which seems to be a very dangerous, big man-centered folkloric, not just communication system, but actually it starts to influence the very texture and structure of society. And then you've got the other, which yes, the state is underdeveloped in Ukraine and there's still nepotism, corruption, and so on, but you don't have that adoration of the leader. And perhaps you're moving away from this sort of fabulistic, anecdotal mode of communicating how politics works.
Well, and I know you have a very strong awareness of the decentralization reforms which took place in Ukraine between 2014 and 2020. Basically, they were completed, and this is one of the main manifestations of it's a realignment of how Ukraine as a people, Ukrainian people, perceive authority with the reality. So the irreality was the Soviet method of the top-down approach, and whenever we hear, I think Donald's son said something the other day about Zelensky's only got 5 minutes left unless he gives in to peace. And you just, like, people who know Ukraine and who've gotten to know Ukraine will understand that President Zelensky, he doesn't have the power to impose a peace. And he understood that in December 2019 in Paris, and where it seemed like we still don't know really the truth of this, but for a small moment in the autumn of 2019, it looked like Moscow, Paris, Berlin, Washington, and London were going to persuade President Zelenskyy to sacrifice, to allow elections in Russia-occupied Luhansk and Donetsk before Ukraine had regotten control of their borders. But there was this no to capitulation movement which grew up in Ukraine, and which Johnny and Jane come latelys to understanding Ukraine still aren't aware of. And President Zelenskyy learned this lesson in 2019, whether or not he ever intended to allow elections. This was the Minsk. Russia said, oh, hold elections and then we'll give you control of your territory again. And Ukraine said, no, no, no. Minsk says we have to hold elections, then or you have to give us control of our borders, then we'll hold elections in the occupied. And this is what went around and around and around. And it's brilliantly worded, the Minsk agreements, in that both interpretations were correct of it. So no one can say they were breaching it. But this idea that President Zelenskyy is the big man, can bring his people behind him, is a fundamental misunderstanding of Ukrainians and of the way power works in Ukraine. And I learned this from going to talk to hundreds of elected leaders in these decentralized villages, which had been Soviets under the USSR and had never had self-government before the Russian occupation began in the Russian Empire, and they really took to it like a duck to water, because it meant basically these local villages kept 50% of their taxes, which for anyone coming from the UK or from Ireland, which have these very centralized systems where all the or the money comes from the centre to the municipalities and to the village councils. It was amazing to me to see it. And that was a great way of showing that Ukrainians themselves, they want self-government. And it was also a way of inoculating against a Russian occupation, because those people in the parts of eastern Ukraine where I spent 7 years, who might have been Russia curious or thought, oh, maybe we'll give the Russians a chance, when they experienced true self-government as they did, true self-governance as they did between 2014 and 2022, and things were really improving. They had streetlights, they had roads, they had all of these things which Russian occupiers had never experienced before. They realized, oh, actually, we can. The center, Kyiv, is useful to us because it can give us resources back, and we can do it ourselves. We can do all of these things ourselves. And Yanukovych, as you say, and these leaders don't have the authority to sacrifice any territory in Ukraine. They wouldn't last 5 minutes. And this is a message which I think we can all in this community, if we understand it, we can communicate to others who have this idea that Washington can impose a peace on Ukraine. I don't think it can, because of this, because Ukrainians have this anarchic, organized anarchic sense of government. And President Zelenskyy, his role is external facing, and I think Ukrainians respect him for that. And what goes domestically and in Parliament and in his party, they're all a bit annoyed about. And that isn't that doesn't mean they want to jettison him or get rid of him. That's his role. Then there's all of us have different roles inside and outside Ukraine. There's the soldier's role, there's the army's role, and everyone has their role. And President Zelenskyy has his role, but this role is allocated by 42 million Ukrainians, not by some FSB elite or nomenclatura. And this is why I know Ukraine will prevail, and I just hope it happens sooner rather than later.
Well, here's the last question. I think this might be a sort of quick one, but it echoes something we talked about before we hit record, and I think it's an interesting insight on your part here. And that there's two common factors here, which, as they start to play out, could produce interesting results for Ukraine. One insight is that Russia overplays its hand, and that harks back to quite a good book that came out, I think, in 2023 called Overreach, one of the first books on the war by Ern Matthews, and it very much describes that through hubris, through poor information, through the desire of an autocrat to impose his will and a failure to understand that people like Ukrainians are different from his own population, Russia overplays its hand. It also feels that through, whether it be coercive control or overt violence, that they will always have the upper hand over rules-based societies. And that's, of course, not always the case. I think we're going to need another episode to actually unpack some of this stuff, especially around coercive control. So one truth, Russia overplays its hand, often to its detriment. The other that you mentioned is that Donald Trump betrays everyone. And for those who are watching this who might be, Trump curious or in the MAGA audience, they might be horrified that. But just look back at every single person he has worked with, every single person that was part of his private organization, um, everybody who was in his cabinet, all of them have fallen out with him. Every single one of them, pretty much, and then gone on to write. Those who have, got the courage to that, have gone on to write absolutely scathing things about him. This is a kind of commonality. So if you combine these two things, hubristic overreach of the Russians, with the fact that Trump eventually betrays everybody, what might be the implication here for Ukraine? Because this seems that this dynamic suggests that eventually Trump will betray Russia, throw it under the bus.
Yeah, it definitely could happen. And again, it goes back to the micro, the folkloric dunce who repeats the same mistake, wakes up the next morning with no learning, repeats it again and again and again. And I see, I'm trying to interpret what's happening with these so-called appointments of potential cabinet members. And I think what's going on there is Donald is trying to exercise coercive control over Republican Senate and House of Representatives members. So he's sort of feeding them these unlikable, impossible to approve people, and then someone else will come up through the middle. But he, as the great dictator, and I use that in the sense of President Zelenskyy saying that he admires Charles Chaplin because of his depiction of the great dictator, because this is how you bring great dictators down to heel. You make fun of them. And it has even been suggested in a brilliant article about in a German newspaper on the road to war that the entire war was provoked by the fact that in Paris 2019, Putin arrived in Paris. He was persuaded to go to Paris because he was sure this comedian was going to surrender Luhansk and Donetsk to him. And in fact, President Zelenskyy made fun of him at the press conference, and it's suggested that the psychic result of this is Putin just decided, I must conquer, I must kill this guy. And so we see this this pattern repeating with both Putin and Donald. And the Russians are brilliant
Trump
at
was
provoking.
mocked. Trump was famously mocked in the foreign correspondents' dinner, and you could see him sitting there seething, pretty sure plotting his revenge. And for those who think this is wild speculation, before Putin was able to tame the oligarchs, in the early 2000s, one of his first actions was to try to compromise and take over all independent media. One would think in order to control the news. Actually, I don't think that was his first priority. His first priority was to shut down satirical programs, programs that would erode that aura of, big man infallibility.
Yeah, and it's almost magical that we have President Zelenskyy, whose TV production company was one of the most, or if not the most successful television companies, production companies over the entire post-Soviet space, created by him and his friends, some of his childhood friends, and his wife, also a great writer. And one couldn't ask for a better CV to confront this particular situation, and someone who perceives the arc of history in a humorous way and has control of emotions, and clearly is very, if anyone's seen him dancing, is very comfortable with his own body and his being, and against so my money is not, now I've recently lost €100 bet on that. I thought Kamala Harris would win. But if I was a betting man, and I'm certainly not anymore, not after losing €100, I wouldn't bet against President Zelenskyy being able to facilitate the natural tensions that will arise between Putin and the Russians, who I see as a really deep psychic aspect of the Russian mind, is they do think of themselves as nothings, and this is why they have to do such terrible, terrible things. And they're always, as one Russian once said to me in a candid moment, everything we touch turns to, and I really see that in Ukraine and everything. And then Disinfolklore, of course, covers up for this. And then you wake up the next day with a new story, and hopefully no one will remember what happened the day before, and you start off again. The same thing happens. So they do have this sense of making this this error, this projecting and blaming, scapegoating, but really they understand it's them. They're causing it, all of this chaos.
And that triggers a memory of mine as well. There was a class of anecdotes which are easy to understand. And a friend of mine actually wrote his PhD dissertation on political anecdotes. So he gathered thousands of these things and was put in the context of comparing them to anecdotes in the 90s, which were very much, a lot of them were focused on the rise of the so-called New Russians, which is the sort of, slightly thuggish, slightly boorish class of semi-thug entrepreneur that sort of rose up in the 90s and looking for sort of commonalities and differences. But there was a whole class of Soviet/90s anecdotes which I didn't really understand. They tell me these jokes, people would fall about laughing, and I'm like, I don't get it. The reason I didn't get it is because I had an elevated view of Russia. I wasn't looking at it in a demeaning way as being inferior. Um, I was trying to look at it as a sort of something to look at rationally and non-judgmentally. This entire class of anecdotes was literally about how everything Russia touches turning to shit. Literally, that was the core mechanic of these anecdotes. And everyone got it because they recognized the patterns in historic behavior. And it was just an endless retelling of that sort of core mechanic in a variety of creative ways. But I not just didn't get it, but even though the evidence was all around, because in the 90s things were pretty grim and dysfunctional, you didn't quite want to sort of, believe that, and you didn't have the same lived experience of Russians who come up through the Soviet Union. So I think this strikes, so many chords. We could carry on talking for hours. I realize that I've got through about a third of my questions, which means we should definitely have another conversation in a couple of weeks' time,
Right.
because there's
That's
clearly plenty of stuff to work our way through. But for today, Stephen, thank you so much for coming back on.
great to be here. Thank you, Jonathan.